Welcome to the next week of AP Government. Last week we talked about the Articles of Confederation and some of the problems there were with it, as well as Shays' Rebellion. And then we talked about the creation of the Constitution and some of the compromises that led to the creation of the Constitution. This week we're going to dive in deeper to the Constitution itself. Let's go.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. To ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the United States of America.
So now that they had that whole representation issue figured out, now the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had to figure out pretty much everything else about government. Now, going into it, there were some principles that they definitely wanted to put into the Constitution. For one, they wanted separation of powers, and that's a design of government that distributes power across institutions in order to avoid making one branch too powerful on its own. And a quote there is, "Separated institutions sharing power." They share power in a way to where power is kind of separated out from just one branch having it all. The other principle they wanted to put into the document was checks and balances. And that's a design of government in which each branch has powers that can prevent the other branches from making policy. And that was based out of a fear of too much concentration of unchecked power in a single executive. I always kind of think,
so come on and tickety-tack yourself before you wreck yourself.
So under this system of checks and balances, each branch of government kind of has overlapping powers that allow it to counteract something the other branch does. So again, it kind of makes sure that no one branch has completely exclusive power. And then the other principle is federalism, and that's the sharing of power between the national government and the states. That's a really important term to understand, and it's going to be an important term as we go throughout this course. The concept of federalism would give multiple access points for citizens to be engaged in government or to participate in government in any particular way. And to be honest with you, students get those three terms mixed up all the time. They're kind of difficult to differentiate. So to help you out with that, I decided to jump into paint and try to illustrate the differences. Let's start with separation of powers. First, with separation of powers, you have to understand that there are three branches to the government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Separation of powers means that really overall, each branch has a designated primary function. For the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is made up of the House and the Senate, you know that the primary function of the legislative branch is to make the law. The executive branch, which is made up of the president, the vice president, and their cabinet members, which we'll talk about later in the year, their primary function is to actually enforce the law. The judicial branch, who's made up of the Supreme Court, has the primary function of trying to interpret and judge the law to see if the law actually is constitutional or not. And if you think of any law, really that makes sense. There's always three primary parts to a law. Someone that thinks of a law, then decides to actually write it, it gets voted on and passed, and then it moves on to the executive, where the executive now has to actually enforce that law. Once they enforce the law, if there's any disputes or any problems that arise from that law, then it goes to the judges, and the judges judge the law and kind of review it. And after reviewing the law, the judge makes a decision on if the law is fair, if it has been applied fairly in that particular case. And in some cases, judges might even decide what the penalty for breaking the law should be. And then there's checks and balances, which is a little bit different. Instead of an overlying primary function, checks and balances is where each branch has the ability to block the other branch from carrying out one of its powers. It always makes me think of this scene from The Office. And again here, the idea is that each branch has enough power to create a stalemate where they don't get anything done unless they all agree to it. And as The Office so accurately displays, this is usually the result. But hey, if you want a limited government that doesn't have much power to abuse the rights of the people, then creating a system where there's constant stalemate and the government can't get out of its own way is actually the perfect system then. Then there's federalism, where the analogy that's always used with federalism is that of a layered cake, where the top layer represents the national government, which takes care of things like national defense and the currency. Then the middle layer is the state government, which takes care of things like highways, education, and so forth. And then the bottom layer is the local government, which takes care of things like utilities, local roads, and crime, and all that good stuff. This might sound incredibly stupid, but you can think of federalism by thinking Mr. Lucas fed us layered cake. Maybe I can get you guys layered cake. Probably not due to CDC guidelines. Hey, there's an example of federalism. You're going to see in our chapter on federalism, which is actually chapter 3 here in just a couple weeks, that things are going to get much more complicated. Our analogy of a layered cake is actually going to turn into a whole different type of cake, but we'll save that for later. In fact, with all these things, these are very simple illustrations of how they work. In AP government, you're going to see things actually are far more complicated than that. In fact, let's go ahead and start making it more complicated right now. So in your textbook, you should see this chart here that's labeled powers of each branch. So let's go ahead and go through that. Over to the left, you'll see lawmaking authority. Under the executive branch, they execute the laws, meaning they actually enforce them. And a way I always think of that is they literally can execute people for breaking the law. They work to shape the legislative agenda. A lot of times the president can make speeches and kind of signal to Congress, here's what I want you guys to do. The president also has the power to veto legislation, and veto means to reject. And we'll talk more about that later. They can also nominate judges to the federal judiciary. That means they can pick people to be on the Supreme Court. They can also nominate key executive branch officials. As we'll talk about later in the year, they have a whole cabinet that helps them enforce the law. They also give the State of the Union address where, again, they can actually shape the legislative agenda by talking about what they want to get done throughout the year. Then the legislative branch, which really has the primary lawmaking authority, they have the ability to write the nation's laws. They can override a presidential veto if they have enough votes to do that. It's a 2/3 majority in both houses. They can also determine the number of Supreme Court justices. In the Constitution, there's no set number, so they could actually create a law that might amend that. They can create lower courts as well if they feel like the Supreme Court has too many cases on their load. The judicial branch then has the ability to interpret contested laws. Maybe there's a dispute over a word or a misunderstanding, or maybe they feel laws being implemented unfairly. They can declare both federal and state laws unconstitutional. Then let's go to national security and foreign policy responsibilities. Really, the executive branch has the primary functions here. The president acts as the commander-in-chief of the military. That means really they are the boss of the entire military. They also set the foreign policy agenda and they negotiate treaties. It's a heck of a lot easier when you're trying to deal with other countries to talk to one person instead of talking to over 500 people in their government, all of whom might have different opinions on what should be done. The power of the legislative branch when it comes to national security and foreign policy is to declare war. Now, that's a little bit murky and has changed over time. We'll get more into that later. The Senate also has the sole privilege of being able to ratify any treaties that the president might negotiate. Famously, the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles after World War I that Woodrow Wilson negotiated, meaning that we were not members of the League of Nations. So the legislative branch does have some power there. When it comes to judicial branch, they don't really have any powers when it comes to national security and foreign policy. In terms of oversight, and oversight means basically making sure everyone is doing what they're supposed to do. The executive branch oversees the federal bureaucracy, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to that. In terms of the legislative branch, well, the House can issue articles of impeachment. The Senate would then hold impeachment trials over the president, the executive branch officials, and the federal judges. And impeachment basically means you're being charged with a crime, and then the Senate can decide if the president or the federal officials are guilty or not guilty. If you paid attention to the news last year, you know President Trump became the third president in history to be impeached, although the Senate acquitted him. That means they found him not guilty of the 2 charges of impeachment the House created. Then there's the budget authority and oversight over the executive branch agencies. As again, we'll learn later, the House of Representatives and the Senate can actually cut the budget to a federal agency that they think is doing a bad job, or maybe an executive branch bureaucracy they think is doing something poorly. The Senate can confirm those judicial nominees that the president makes, and then the Senate can also confirm key executive branch officials in the cabinet. Then the judicial branch can declare executive branch actions in conflict with the Constitution unconstitutional. So any executive orders the president might issue can be struck down by the judicial branch. Whew. Did you get all that? I know it can be really overwhelming and it's a lot to take in. This is really just to kind of introduce you to some of the checks and balances and powers of each branch. Throughout the year, we're going to keep going over them. I don't expect you to have all of this memorized by the end of chapter 2, but I do want you to be familiar with it and to take a good, hard, long look at it. So really where I want you to be after this chapter is if I say something like, hey, Congress can override the president's veto by a 2/3 majority in both houses, I don't want you to say, whoa, I've never heard of that before. That's new information. I'd rather you say, oh yeah, that's right. So anyway, let's hone in on the legislative branch and what the founding fathers provided as powers for the legislative branch in the Constitution. So after the preamble to the Constitution, you know, the famous part that goes,
We the people.
we begin with the articles of the Constitution. And Article 1 is exclusively about the legislative branch. To find Congress's powers, you have to go down to Article 1, Section 8. And this is probably the most important part of Article 1 I want you to know. Article 1, Section 8 is where the Congress's powers are specifically listed. And you'll see it starts out by saying the Congress shall have the power to, and then it lists all of its powers. Things like borrowing money, regulating interstate commerce, taxes. Oh yeah, hey, that's a new one. I'll let you take a closer look at all of the powers that are given to Congress. In this Section 8, these are where we find enumerated or expressed powers. That means these powers are actually specifically written in the Constitution as powers that Congress have. Enumerated express powers are authorities specifically granted to a branch of government in the Constitution. So this is where we find the legislative branch's enumerated powers. It means I can literally see it written there. If you've ever heard at the end of NFL games,
Rebroadcast or other use of this telecast without the express written consent of the NFL is prohibited.
Do you have the express written consent of ABC Sports and the National Football League?
Just ABC.
think about that. Express means that you can literally see it in writing. So everything you see listed here are enumerated powers of Congress, except for that very last line down there at the bottom. That last part says, the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So let's break this down piece by piece. That first part says to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. This means Congress can make laws that might be necessary. That means they might be demanded for some particular reason. It says for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So this means to carry into effect. That word foregoing means everything we just listed before in Article 1, Section 8 up to this point. All of those powers, you have the ability to pass a law that helps you carry out one of those powers that's already been listed. Still confused? Let me give you an example. In Article 1, Section 8, it's an expressed enumerated power that Congress has the power to maintain an army and a navy. But it doesn't say anywhere in there that Congress can purchase an aircraft carrier. I mean, after all, back then they didn't even know what an aircraft carrier was. Well, if you were to strictly interpret the Constitution and the powers that Congress has according to just what's written in there, if Congress tried to pass a bill buying an aircraft carrier, then you would say Congress doesn't have the power to do that. Therefore, they can't. So this clause gives some freedom and flexibility for Congress to be able to maybe do some things that aren't specifically listed in here, because let's face it, it would be impossible to list everything Congress would need to do in order to carry out some of these things. It allows for that flexibility for Congress to pass a law that helps them carry out one of these enumerated powers. Now, this clause of the Constitution is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And again, that's in Article 1, Section 8, which grants Congress necessary powers to carry out those specifically listed enumerated powers that are listed right before it. Now, the power to pass a law to carry out an express power is called an implied power because it's not specifically written in the Constitution. It's kind of implied. So implied powers are authority of the federal government that goes beyond its express power. By the way, sometimes the necessary and proper clause is referred to as the elastic clause because it provides some sort of elasticity, which is a fancy word for saying flexibility, kind of like a rubber band. In fact, a lot of people use the rubber band as the analogy for the elastic clause because it allows Congress to stretch things out if they need to carry out an enumerated power. Think of implied powers like a fence. If you come across a fence, usually it's implied that you're not allowed over within a certain specific area. It may not specifically say you're not allowed to, but if you see a fence, it usually implies that. Think of expressed or enumerated powers as a do not enter sign, where it literally says do not enter. You can see it there in writing. All right, let's shift gears now and go from the legislative branch and take a look at Article 2 of the Constitution, which focuses on the executive branch. In Article 2 of the Constitution, we see a single executive, meaning that there's one president, one person kind of in charge of the entire executive branch. And believe it or not, there were actually some people that came up with the idea that there should be multiple executives, maybe even like 3 presidents. Benjamin Franklin was a proponent of that idea. Some argued that there should be one president from the North, one president from the South, and one president from the middle states. But as we're going to see next week, Alexander Hamilton fought vociferously for there to only be one president. The president is given a 4-year term. Originally in the Constitution, there were no term limits. So the president would be elected, they would serve for 4 years, and they would be up for re-election. They could run again, or they could choose to resign. The job of the president was to carry out the laws that had been passed by Congress. However, most of their powers are shared with Congress in order to prevent tyranny, so that again, no one would have all of the power. For example, the president has a hand in the legislative process, which enables them to veto any potential bill Congress wants to turn into a law. Again, veto means to reject something, to reject a potential law. The president's also the commander-in-chief, which means that they oversee not just the military, but they also oversee the execution of the law. And that can be by the bureaucracy, for example. If the president doesn't like a particular law, sometimes the president can choose not to enforce it at all, which has actually happened historically. Andrew Jackson. The president can also make treaties, as I had mentioned before. Now we get to one of the most confusing and bizarre concepts in all of American government. The Electoral College. The Electoral College is a system used by the United States to elect both the president and the vice president. Here's how it works. Each state is granted a certain amount of delegates to this Electoral College. The amount of delegates a state gets is determined by the number of representatives they have in the House of Representatives and the number of senators they have. So, for example, California has 53 representatives in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. Therefore, they have 55 delegates that vote in the Electoral College. We sometimes refer to the delegates as Electoral College votes. So this means the more populated states will have more Electoral College votes, like California, who has the most at 55, and the least populated states will have the least amount of Electoral College votes, like Wyoming, who has 3. The amount of Electoral College votes a state gets is reassessed every 10 years after the census, which counts up how many people live in each state. There's actually a census this year. Every 4 years when there's a presidential election coming up, each state gets to decide who its delegates are going to be. The process for selecting those delegates is left for every state to decide. So when you go to the voting booth in the presidential election, you're not actually voting directly for the president. What you're doing is voting for a delegate to vote for that candidate on your behalf. So after all of a state's votes for president are counted up, whoever wins the state is the person that gets the majority of votes in the state. The delegates who pledge to vote for that candidate are then chosen by the state and sent to Washington, D.C. in December to actually vote for the president. Whichever candidate gets the most electoral votes ends up winning the election and becomes president. So to summarize that, you vote for president, but not really. You're actually voting for a delegate to vote for a particular candidate on your behalf. That delegate's the middleman, and then whenever they go and actually vote in December, that determines the real winner of the presidential election. Now, you might have some questions like, is it possible for that delegate or elector, whatever you want to call them, to change their mind and vote against the will and the majority of the state? Yes, it is possible, and it has happened quite a few times in the past. Now, in some states, there are called faithless elector laws, where if an elector votes against the majority of their state, then that elector is either removed and replaced or they're given a fine or penalty. But most of the time, states choose electors that they know are going to vote with whatever the majority of the state said. Another question you might be thinking is, hey, is it possible then that the majority of people throughout the whole country could have voted for a particular candidate, but the Electoral College votes for the other candidate? Yes, that's happened before too. It's actually happened 5 times in U.S. history where the popular vote has lost the presidential election. Most recently in 2016, when Hillary Clinton actually got more votes than Donald Trump did, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College and won the presidency. We'll swing back around and revisit the Electoral College later on. However, what you need to know now is that the people do not directly vote for the President of the United States. And part of the reason for this Electoral College is the fact that the people making this document, at least many of them, did not really trust the people to make wise political decisions. I mean, have you seen political debates on social media? They did not trust your everyday common person to make such a decision. Instead, they trusted the educated elite to potentially reverse a very poor decision that the people made. Sometimes I sympathize with that. Then we hit Article 3, which talks about the judicial branch. The judicial branch is a system of federal courts responsible for hearing and deciding cases through those federal courts. A lot of times when we think of the judicial branch, we think of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. They're top dog. But there's actually a ton of lower courts underneath the Supreme Court that filter those cases out until they get there. And those lower courts are created by Congress. Now, federal courts have jurisdiction to handle disputes between the states and the national government, between two or more states, and between citizens of different states. Interestingly enough, the Constitution actually doesn't specifically say that the Supreme Court and federal courts can strike down federal laws unconstitutional. It wasn't until years later in a Supreme Court case called MARBURY versus Madison that the power of judicial review was officially established as a power of the Supreme Court. By the way, MARBURY versus Madison is one of your required Supreme Court cases. And the details of that case are kind of complicated, and I'll have you look at that later. But for now, all you need to know is that the case established judicial review as a power of the Supreme Court. Judicial review is the ability of the courts to overturn a law or executive action. But like I said, the power of judicial review isn't expressly written in the Constitution. Whenever I hear the phrase judicial review, I think of a football official on the field saying the play is under further review. They'll then go into the tent and look at the replay to make sure what occurred on the field follows the rules of the game. The next article of the Constitution, Article 4, talks about the relationships between the states, what to do if there's a fugitive that runs out of state and runs into another state. How is that handled? What about being able to travel in between states and all of that? Then Article 5 of the Constitution talks about how the Constitution can be changed. And this is similar to the idea that we saw Thomas Jefferson talk about last week.
I am increasingly persuaded that the earth belongs exclusively to the living, and that one generation has no more right to bind another to its laws and judgments than one independent nation has the right to command another.
Those who created the Constitution wanted it to be flexible so that future generations could change it to suit their needs or to keep up with the times. So in order to do that, they created a process for the Constitution to be amended. And that word amended means you can change it, a change in or addition to a legal document. But considering the fact that the Constitution is the most supreme legal document in the entire country, they didn't want to make it so easy to where anyone could just change the Constitution on a whim. They made it a very long and difficult process to make sure everyone, or at least almost everyone, was on board with whatever the change was going to be. Changing the Constitution is a two-stage process. Number one, you need passage by a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, or passage in a national convention called at the request of 2/3 of the states. The second stage is a majority vote in 3/4 of the state legislatures, that means the state governments, or acceptance by ratifying conventions in 3/4 of the states. And a convention is just basically a big party where every county sends delegates and then they all just vote by like a raise of hands or something. So let's say you were really passionate about something and you wanted to make something illegal, something I hate. Making steak well done. Let's say you wanted to pass a constitutional amendment that made it illegal for people to cook steak well done. Well, likely someone would be able to use the First Amendment to defend themselves and say freedom of expression to cook steak however they want. So you would actually have to change the Constitution. You'd have to get a constitutional amendment to make cooking steak well done illegal. In order to do that, you would want to contact either your representative in the House of Representatives or one of your 2 state senators. They would then propose the amendment, and then it would have to be approved by 2/3 majority in not just the House of Representatives, but also the Senate, or vice versa. So it has to be passed by a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. After that, it then has to be ratified by the states. And if it's ratified by the states, it can either be done through the state legislatures or by state convention. So if it's done by the state legislatures, that's where they take a copy of your amendment, they take it to all of the state governments. So for example, the Ohio House, the Ohio Senate would take a look at that amendment, and if they vote to approve of it, then it goes on to the other states, and if 3/4 of the states, that's 38 out of 50, vote yes on it, congratulations, it's part of the Constitution. They can do that through the state legislatures or through conventions. 26 out of the 27 amendments have been done through state legislatures. Only the 21st Amendment, which was the repeal of prohibition, used state conventions. So that's Article 5. And by the way, a good way to remember Article 5 is that the Roman numeral for 5 is a V. If you flip that V upside down, it is kind of an A. And A stands for amendment, if that helps you remember. Then there's Article 6 of the Constitution, and really the only significant part of that you'll need to know for this class is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause states that the Constitution and all national treaties and laws shall be the supreme law of the land, meaning the Constitution is top dog. Article 7 of the Constitution talks about how the Constitution will be approved and ratified by the states. The significant part about Article 7 you need to know is the fact that the Constitution and the central government gets its powers from the states. In the same way that Thomas Jefferson talked about governments getting its power from the consent of the governed, the people, the Constitution and the federal government gets their power from the consent of the states, who actually created the Constitution. And in the same way, Jefferson said the people have the right to alter or abolish their government and institute a new government. The states, too, also have the right to alter or to abolish the federal government if they feel that the federal government has abused their natural right. And so like my mother always told me, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Now, is it likely that the states will ever abolish the federal government? No, it's more likely I'll be a world champion sumo wrestler before that would happen. Instead, states always try to alter the powers of the federal government whenever they feel the federal government is perhaps overstepped their bounds. So there's your brief rundown of all 7 articles of the Constitution that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention agreed to. After they agreed to a final draft of just those 7 articles, they shipped off copies of the Constitution to all 13 states so that the state legislatures could debate on if they were going to ratify and approve this Constitution or not. As we're going to see next week, not everyone was on board with this Constitution, and both sides weren't going to go down without a fight. So your assignments for this week, obviously finish this Ed puzzle. It'll be due by Wednesday. Then I'm actually going to upload the Constitution onto Perusal. I want you to take a look through the Constitution and do annotations on it. I want you to particularly take a look at Article 1, Section 8 and see the powers of Congress listed there. Overall, I was really pleased with how well you guys did annotating the Articles of Confederation, so awesome job. Keep it up. Your annotations for the Constitution will be due on Thursday. And last but not least, I want you to finish outlining Chapter 2 by outlining Sections 2.3 and 2.4. That will be due on Friday. Lastly, I did have one really cool, exciting announcement I wanted to share this week. The Civic Simulation Club has been approved by the CTEC board, which means I can start having meetings as soon as possible. I did want to mention that to you all because I know some of you were interested in joining that. In case you forgot my intro video, in this club, we're going to do things like guns and butter, where we have different nations and you guys can make trade deals with each other. You can go to war with one another, decide how to spend your nation's resources. We're going to do Model United Nations. We're also going to try out maybe a mock trial or two, and we're also maybe even going to do a parliamentary simulation. I don't know. It depends on what the students in the club want to do. So keep an eye out for a post in Google Classroom with more information on that. I'll have to have sign-ups so I can figure out how many students are interested in the club so I can get a room that's big enough or small enough to make sure that we maintain social distancing guidelines and all that good stuff. Unfortunately, since we're on Plan B schedule, I'm going to have to do bi-weekly meetings. That means rotate every 2 weeks. So the first week I'll probably do juniors that week, and then the next week I'll do a meeting for seniors, and then the week after that I'll be back to juniors. We'll go back and forth. If we get back to a Plan A schedule, I'll just have one meeting a week with both juniors and seniors combined in the club. So if you're interested, I would love to have you. Just keep an eye out for more information as I post it in Google Classroom. As always, if you all need anything, feel free to shoot me an email or comment on Google Classroom, and I hope you all have a great week.